Welcome to DNW. My name is Rogier from Bemmel, and today I'm joined by Mr. Rupert Sheldrake. Mr. Sheldrake, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
It's wonderful that you made the time to speak with us for a little while. Let me introduce you for the few viewers and listeners that might have not heard of you. We are mostly a Dutch audience, I presume, so some people might not have heard of you. You are trained as a biologist, you a biochemist, you've done a lot of research at Cambridge, you've been at Harvard, you've also been in other academic institutions around the world, amongst them India, and you've done some research to formative causation, and then you found out that within the existing paradigm, it's difficult to explain how that really works. And then you've gone on to write a lot of interesting books, which put you outside of academia for the most part. Morphic resonance is your main field of research. So we'll talk about that today. And I think because you were not really accepted within the scientific community anymore, some people even call you a pseudoscientist, you've also developed some critique of modern science, which has notably been worked out in your book about the science delusion. Is that a fair summary of your main interests and your werdegang?
Fairly fair. I still do most of my time. I'm still doing scientific research. I've published about 20 papers in peer-reviewed journals in the last 5 years. So I'm very active in scientific research. It's just that I don't do it inside a university. But I'm certainly think of myself as an active research scientist.
Okay, yeah, that's a good nuance. Yeah, you still conduct scientific research, but it's not always. Although peer-reviewed journals are within some sort of a community usually. So.
Oh yes. I'm in favor of peer-reviewed journals, and I publish my papers in them, and so yeah, I believe in playing science by the rules. So that's what I try to do.
Wonderful. Well, shall we dive into the concept of morphic resonance, maybe? And where shall we start? Well, you've developed this concept, I believe, as a reaction to people that say that the forms in nature, certain behaviors can be explained from a strictly mechanical materialist point of view. You've said, oh, this is not really the case, and you've developed this concept to as a hypothesis of how things might work. Is that right? Can you elaborate on that a little bit for our audience?
Yes. Well, I came to this idea of morphic resonance when I was working at Cambridge in developmental biology, particularly with plant development. And so it didn't come out of esoteric ideas or Oriental philosophy or anything like that. It came out of hardcore biology. And I became convinced that you can't explain the forms of plants or the instincts of animals, which are inherited, just in terms of genes. What genes do is code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins, and some of them are involved in switching on or off other genes. So just making the right proteins isn't enough to give you a leaf or a petal or a root or an embryo of an animal. It's more than just the genes. But when you build a house, you don't just need bricks and cement and reinforcing steel and timber. You actually need an architect's plan as well. You certainly need the materials, but the genes explain the materials and the structure of the materials in living organisms. They don't explain their form or their behavior. And so I became convinced there must be another way of thinking about this. And in fact, there was another way. I didn't invent the idea of morphogenetic form-shaping fields. This was first invented in the 1920s and had been developed by a lot of biologists, a kind of minority school of biology, a more holistic approach. The genetic approach and the molecular biology approach was very reductionistic, trying to reduce everything to molecules, which is the aim of molecular biology, as the name implies. Whereas this more holistic approach said that in developing organisms, there are organizing fields which shape what happens. And they're analogous to magnetic fields. If you look at the iron filings around a magnet, for example, the field has a shape, a structure. You can't see it, it's invisible. But the iron filings line up in lines of force around the magnet in a particular structure from an invisible field which is within and around the magnet. And the idea of morphogenetic or form shaping fields, when it was first put forward by developmental biologists working on fungi and on animals, and then later on plants, was the idea that in a developing leaf, for example, there's a kind of invisible leaf-shaped field that shapes the leaf as it grows, like a mold. And it's a holistic principle. It works from the top down rather than the bottom up. And this helps to explain a number of features of biology. For example, if you take a sea urchin embryo and at an early stage you cut it in half, what develops is not two half sea urchins, but two small but complete sea urchins. Each part of it, which would normally only give part of the sea urchin, can give the whole sea urchin. And it's similar to a magnet. If you cut a bar magnet in half, you don't get one North Pole and one South Pole. You get two small magnets with a complete magnetic field. So there's something holistic about fields. And so this is really a field theory of development. As I say, I didn't invent this. It's already well established. And there are biologists today working with this concept, most notably Michael Levin at Tufts University in the United States. Mm-hmm. What I contributed to this approach was the question of looking at the question of where do the fields come from? If you have these fields that shape organisms, what gives the field its shape in the first place? And there are two possibilities. One is that there are field equations in some kind of Platonic space outside space and time, and that these govern what happens. This is the usual approach of scientists. Even if they claim to be hard-nosed empiricists, they're usually secret Platonists, because most of them believe that nature is governed by eternal mathematical laws that were all there at the moment of the Big Bang. They don't think about it very much. They just take it for granted. The trouble is, with eternal laws for morphogenetic fields, it makes biology completely non-historical. The morphogenetic fields for the dinosaurs would have been there at the moment of the Big Bang. They'd still be here today. It wouldn't really matter for these equations whether the dinosaurs had evolved or not, or whether they'd gone extinct. But biology is radically evolutionary and historical. What happens depends on what's happened before. And so the idea of morphic resonance is that these form-shaping fields have an inherent memory which comes from previous organisms of the same kind. Each species has a kind of collective memory. Each individual contributes to it and draws upon it. And therefore, there's a cumulative memory. And so inheritance doesn't just involve inheriting genes through DNA or even epigenetic modifications of the genes through the methylation of DNA or through changing the proteins that surround it, but largely depends on morphic resonance from past organisms of the same species. And this is a testable theory. It says that if you train rats to learn a new trick in Amsterdam, for example, then rats in London and New York and Sydney, Australia, should all learn the same trick quicker, just because the Dutch rats have learned it. On the basis of similarity, it has to be the same breed and the same trick. And it also means that if you solve the Times crossword puzzle today, it will help make it easier for others to solve it. And in fact, people have found that it's easier to do the Times crossword puzzle the next day instead of on the morning when it's published. So there's a collective memory, and I think it affects all our lives. And perhaps the most radical implication of this theory is that our own memories are not stored inside our brains, which is what people usually assume. The normal assumption is memories are stored as modified synapses or phosphorylated proteins or even as modified DNA or RNA inside our brains. Because the materialist assumption on which science is based is that if memory exists, which it does, then it must be material, because everything must be material or physical. So it must be inside the brain. But I don't think it's like that at all. I think that we tune into our memories by morphic resonance from the past. And the reason we tune into our own memories is because we're more similar to ourselves in the past than to anyone else. And morphic resonance depends on similarity. So we're more similar to ourselves, so we have our own memories, but we're also similar to other people, especially members of our family and similar, the same culture. And so there's a collective memory as well. But I'm suggesting individual memory and collective memory differ in degree, but not in kind. Whereas the conventional view is that if there's a collective memory at all of the kind presumed by Jung, then it's completely different from individual memory, which depends on changes inside the brain. So roughly, that's the idea. And it's controversial because it's not the way that most scientists think about these things. But I think it fits the evidence better and provides us with a more reasonable way of thinking about nature. I think nature has habits, not laws. And I think that the habits of nature, the whole of nature, including physics and chemistry, evolve along with the cosmos.
Well, thank you for that very clear overview of the theory. You've covered a lot, some testability of this idea in how we learn or how these habits seem to create or seem to get ever stronger. If one group of rats discovers something, and we've seen this recently with the orca whales. Once one group starts tipping over boats, then all over the world, suddenly these groups seem to learn this behavior. I don't know if this has been thoroughly studied, but it was a nice example, I think, of this idea. You've also touched on this, on the idea of memory, individual memory, collective memory. So maybe we can dive in a little deeper already, because these kind of fields, these morphogenetic fields, they are not consistent of matter. Obviously, they are not in space-time. They are not even energetic. As far as I can gather from what I've read, they're actually not describable at all in a conventional way. So I was interested in how you would explain this, and maybe to save some time, you've told elsewhere that you've done LSD and DMT and other. You've had other transcendental or transcendental-like experiences. You're a transcendental meditator yourself. Is there a way of seeing these fields in your imagination? Is your research led by some sort of more concrete idea of what these fields are, or is this just a very dry hypothesis? And do you just try to use it as such in your research, which you do, of course? But
well, first of all, I would say that let's separate the topics of psychedelics and these fields, because the fields don't depend on psychedelic experience or, so in a way, a separate part of my life. But the fields are describable. The fields are local. Your fields within and around your body, my fields within and around my body. The field of a developing cabbage plant is within and around the cabbage plant. What's non-local is the resonance between fields across space and time, morphic resonance, which connects things from the past to the present across space and time. But the fields themselves are local. Now
you're describing them in terms of what they do, not what they are, correct?
Well, I'm talking about what they do, but if you ask this question, well, what are they? What are they made of? Then if I say to you, what's a gravitational field made of? Or what's an electromagnetic field made of? This would then become a difficult problem to answer, because, Newton, when he proposed gravity, had no idea how matter could attract other matter across empty space. Actually, he thought God did it. He thought that God, the sense organ of God, was empty space, absolute space, and God's omniscience and omnipotence were responsible for gravity, that matter itself couldn't possibly attract matter throughout the whole universe, just matter. So then Einstein came along with the idea of the gravitational field, saying this is geometric, that the gravitational field isn't in space and time, it is space-time. And the structure of the gravitational field, that if I drop something, it falls to Earth, and you and I sitting on chairs, we're not floating around. That's because the gravitational field is acting upon us. But
we had a physicist on the show, and he said one of the biggest mysteries in physics is what makes the sun warp space-time. They don't know it.
Well, exactly. So what is the gravitational field? I wonder if physicists who take LSD or DMT actually see it or something, but nobody knows what it is. To say it's geometric means that it's a property of space itself. Now, and then the electromagnetic field, you see, Faraday, when he first put forward the idea of electric and magnetic fields, didn't know what they were. He knew what he thought of them as regions of influence in space. That was the definition.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had two theories. One is that the fields were, as he put it, modifications of mere space. He liked that idea best, but 19th century was rather materialistic. And so he said the other possibility is that they're made of subtle matter, the ether. And when Maxwell developed his equations of electromagnetism, he assumed the fields were made of subtle matter, the ether, and that ether was what conducted light. But when Einstein put forward his special theory of relativity, he said the ether doesn't exist. The electromagnetic fields are made of what? They're made of the fields themselves. They're nothing other than spatial patterns that have these effects. And so they're not made of anything. And in superstring theory or M theory, where physicists try and unify the different fields of nature, the strong nuclear fields, the electromagnetic and the gravitational fields, they try and do it in terms of a 10-dimensional or 11-dimensional primal field. So it's fields all the way down. And what are they made of? Dimensional patterns in space. So the thing is, I don't think that morphogenetic fields need to be more concrete than the fields of physics, which are talked about without embarrassment in physics textbooks and university courses, even though we don't understand what they are and we can't see them. I think they're similar in nature. I think it's another kind of field.
Yeah, and that's I can follow what you're saying, and then the physicist might say, well, the gravitational field is very well defined. We have a clear formula of what it does, and then well, you would probably say, well, first of all, there's dark matter, and second of all, even the physiological constants. You don't believe that they have been constant or are constant. Is that right?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, if they say the gravitational field explains everything is perfectly well defined, as you rightly say, it doesn't explain everything, which is why they've had to invent dark matter 5 times more than normal matter. Never been observed, no independent evidence for it, but they need it to make their equations balanced to explain the structure of galaxies and so on. So this is far from being a clear, well-defined, totally understood theory. It's utterly obscure. I mean, dark matter is literally obscure, and their whole theory depends on it. So it's not really a very good example of a totally well-defined theory. Well, I think with morphogenetic fields, you see, there are some quantum physicists like the late David Bohm or Professor Bernard Carr in London, who's a leading theoretical physicist, who thinks that morphogenetic fields may be explained in terms of these extra dimensions that you have in superstring or M theory. Bernard Carr points out that superstring and M theory with 10 or 11 dimensions, 1 of time and 9 or 10 of space, have all this extra potential in them. No one knows what all these extra dimensions are doing. They could easily be coupling things up together across space and time. They're in current physical theory, they're severely underemployed. So it may be that even in existing physical theory, there's the possibility of finding a basis for morphogenetic fields. But my main aim is not to come up with speculative theories of what they might be. In fact, I now receive 1 or 2 speculative theories of what they might be every week in my inbox from people who've generated them by AI. So, I mean, this is one of the problems of my life at the moment. I get about 10 theories of everything a week generated by AI. And so do other scientists, not just me. So I don't have the feeling that what we need is more theory. I'm much more interested in evidence, because when Faraday put forward his idea of electric and magnetic fields, there was no mathematics. He didn't know what they were. He just described the phenomena. One of the phenomena was the rotation of electric things in magnetic fields, which gave rise to the electric motor. Now there's millions, hundreds of millions of electric motors in the world. They all work, whatever theory we have. Then Einstein and Maxwell has a theory, Einstein has another theory. And in quantum electrodynamics, the theory of electromagnetic fields now says that all electromagnetic interactions are mediated by virtual photons that pop into being from the zero-point energy field, which underlines everything. Well, no one's ever seen a virtual photon because by definition, they're not observable. We've got now a theory that's based on a field that's supposed to be full of energy that's everywhere. A teaspoonful of it has enough energy to power the world for years. This is a theory. No one's ever observed these things, but electric motors just go on working anyway. If that theory.
And your point is very clear, and I'm sorry for convoluting the questions about how would you describe this field in your own personal experience. But now that we have done this homework of explaining why we don't have to why we don't have to describe what these fields are made of, I'm still very interested in your inspiration for these, if you want to share it, of course. Otherwise, we can just go on to the function of these fields, as you've suggested.
Well, I think that psychedelics can illuminate the nature of the mind, and for me, they've been very helpful. I first took LSD around 1970, so I mean, this goes back a long way. I'm not a sort of psychedelic maniac or anything. I have taken them occasionally over the years, but certainly it's not my main activity or anything like that. But the reason I thought of morphic resonance, in fact, had nothing to do with psychedelics. I was grappling with the question of how these fields could be inherited. I was convinced there must be morphogenetic form-shaping fields. I was convinced they couldn't just be explained by eternal mathematical formulae, because biology is evolutionary. There's a presence of the past in biology in everything that happens. So at that stage, I was I was working in Cambridge, and I was sort of thinking of just for weeks, months, I was thinking, how can they be inherited? It can't be through the genes. There must be some other way. And then I read a book by the great French philosopher Henri Bergson, Matter and Memory, published in French in 1898, in English in 1911. And Bergson was totally out of fashion at the time. But a friend of mine who was interested in French literature told me about Bergson and said he thought I'd be interested. So I read Matter and Memory. And for me, this was a revelatory experience, because what Bergson shows in Matter and Memory is that memory works in a completely different way from matter, and that he was the first person I met who argued that memories are not stored inside the brain, the standard view, which we've already done. And he thought he was thinking only in terms of human episodic memory, remembering particular events as opposed to habits. And he thought this memory involved a completely new kind of causation, of influence across time, at a distance in time, and that memory is not something in space. Memory is a relationship in time. And in the background of that theory was the idea of memory in Plotinus, the Neoplatonic philosopher. Bergson lectured on Plotinus at the Collège de France. So this was rooted in ancient European Platonic philosophy. And the British philosopher Bertrand Russell was very influenced by Bergson in considering another kind of memory, which he called mnemonic causation, M-N-E-M-I-C, mnemic, to do with memory. A form of causation that's different from normal causation is a causation across time. So when I discovered that actually all these people, a long tradition, had considered there was a new kind of causation across time, it was a liberating thought for me. And then it suddenly flashed upon me that morphic resonance, well, the name morphic resonance came to me. There could be a resonance of form across time, of self-organizing rhythmic patterns, because all forms, all nature is rhythmic, or hence resonance across time. And when I went to, after working in Cambridge, I went to India, where I was working in an agricultural research institute, the International Crops Research Institute in Hyderabad. I then discovered, when I started talking about morphic resonance to my Indian colleagues, that their response was totally unlike my colleagues in Cambridge, who were puzzled, baffled, sometimes angry at this idea. My Indian colleagues took it completely differently. They said, oh, there is nothing new in this idea. Ancient rishis and seers have said this thousands of years ago. Of course, there is memory in nature. It is part of karma, their philosophy of karma. And Buddhist philosophy also has this memory built in. So I had the opposite problem in India from in England. In England, people thought this was an outrageous idea and barely comprehensible. Whereas in India, their response was totally blasé, nothing new in this. People have said this for thousands of years. And I said, well, why don't Indian scientists get on and try and test it and do something about it? So the problem there was to try and get them to see that you need to do something about this idea if it's going to change science. It's not enough to sit in a chair and say, ancient rishis have said this thousands of years ago. Anyway, there we are.
I thought the inspiration. I thought I read that somewhere, but then it's good to write direct. I also read that the big influences were Platonic and Bergson, and but I thought I thought LSD had something to do with it, which would have been interesting to me. But
oh well, it has something to do with my views on consciousness, which is another part of my work, but not specifically to do with morphic resonance.
Okay. Well, can we just to tie into the story about India a little bit? What they have this karmic theory and the history in nature. They also have the idea of an Akashic record, of the which is more akin maybe to Jungian collective consciousness. So this goes into deeper archetypal knowledge, maybe spiritual knowledge as well. Not only the knowledge in nature, but also these more spiritual concepts. How do you feel about the likeness between morphogenetic fields and the Akashic records? Can you and Jungian collective unconscious? I know you've spoken about this a lot, but I still think a lot of our viewers would find that very interesting.
Well, I think morphic fields and morphic resonance is and the collective memory is very similar to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. But he was talking just about humans. And what I'm saying is this would apply to dogs and cats and plants and hollyhocks and palm trees and even to atoms and molecules and crystals. That there's a memory in all these things. It's not just humans. So I would say Jung's idea of the collective unconscious is part of a vastly bigger theory of memory in nature. In terms of the Akashic record, it's not the Indian texts don't actually use that phrase. That was a phrase introduced by theosophists in the late 19th century, interpreting Indian philosophy, concept like alaya vijnana, which means seed consciousness. They said there was something like seeds in nature from which what had happened before could grow again, and so on. But they collect the idea of the Akashic record, I think, is a bit misleading because it's a metaphor, and the idea of a record immediately conjures to one's mind either a gramophone record or a filing cabinet or a smart hard drive or something like that. It implies some spatial memory system, and Akash is the element of space. So for some people, it conjures up the image of something like a cloud in the sky, like an iCloud in the sky, which has all this information in it. But of course, computer clouds aren't in the sky. They're in data centers using huge amounts of energy with actual physical hardware storing the information on disks and drives and things and flash drives. So I think the Akashic record gives the wrong idea, the idea of some kind of celestial filing cabinet, the idea that memory is spatial. Like sometimes people say to me, well, where is morphic resonance stored? Well, you see, I think it's the wrong question because, as I said earlier, memory is a relation in time, not in space. And although we store records, carved in stone on Greek inscriptions and Egyptian hieroglyphs and stuff, or written in books or on parchment or now in flash drives and stuff. We store a memory in physical forms. But it's not how our own memories actually work. It's how our cultural memory is preserved in literate cultures. But most cultures were traditionally not literate, and the memory was preserved by oral transmission, which again is much more like this transmission across time, not storage in space. So anyway, I think it's a misleading metaphor, but it's similar. It's saying something similar, that there's a kind of memory in nature.
So how do you explain is not the word, but how do you fit archetypal images that our individual imagination might be fed in dreams, or images that we might get, or psychedelic experiences? How would you account? I know you do account for it in your theory, but maybe you can elucidate a little bit, or elaborate a little bit on that. Let's say we might have the same archetypal ideas in our dreams, but they both enter our individual consciousness. So here we go into the topic of consciousness, perhaps, as well.
Well, I think they're a collective memory, you see, and I think there are some archetypes which are extremely deep, like, for example, the archetypal experience of a baby sucking its mother's breast. And this is archetypal not just for humans, but for all mammals, which by definition breastfeed. So there are some experiences like that, which are very deeply archetypal. There's the experience of being born, coming out through the birth canal, which the psychologist Stan Grof, who did a lot of research on psychedelics in the 60s and 70s, found that many people who took psychedelics, LSD was what he was looking at particularly, had kind of near-death experiences. What they experienced was being in a most horrible situation where being compressed, trapped. They felt, that they were being crushed. They had this awful experience. And then they found themselves going through a kind of tube and out into the light. And then the light was full of peace and joy and bliss and so on. And this is very similar to near-death experiences where people have a terrible accident and they go out of their body and then they go through a kind of tunnel into the light. And this is transformative for many people because when they're in the light, they feel they've seen an aspect of reality they didn't know before. They've experienced it. Many of them lose the fear of death, become much more spiritually interested, and so on. Well, Grof found this happened with a lot of psychedelics, and I think actually for a lot of people, psychedelics today can be a kind of rite of passage of expansion of consciousness, awareness of other realms. That certainly was for me. When I first took LSD, it was very similar to what Grof described. But then you see, he says that traditionally humans have had the experience of being born, and after floating happily in the amniotic fluid inside one's mother's womb for 9 months, suddenly things turn nasty. The womb starts contracting. You start being crushed. You feel trapped. It's no fun being there anymore. You want to get out of there. And what happens? You get out of there through a dark tube that leads you into the light. and then a completely new experience of life happens. And so you could argue that even for people born by cesarean section, there's this deep archetype of this birth experience. Groff argues this is a deep Jungian archetype based on experience. And then if you take cultural archetypes, for example, in India, the elephant-headed god Ganesh is everywhere. There's pictures of Ganesh, his statues in temples, pictures on calendars in people's houses, and so on. You see Ganesh everywhere in India. And Indians have dreams of Ganesh. I discovered online groups where Indians discuss their Ganesh dreams with each other. So Ganesh is part of their dream world. But there are people who've had psychedelics in the West who knew nothing about Indian culture, who've experienced elephant-headed, multi-armed figures that later, when they came across images of Ganesh, they realized this is what they'd seen in their psychedelic experience. I think that psychedelic experiences enable us to enter this dreamlike world. When we enter from sleep into the dream state, then they're often confused and fleeting, our dreams, except if you have a lucid dream, when you learn how to control your dream, waking up within the dream, knowing you're dreaming. But I think psychedelic experiences, visionary experiences with psychedelics, are similar in kind to dreams, but more vivid, more coherent, more experienced in a more enduring way. And so I think that actually there's a big overlap between the archetypes people experience in psychedelic experiences and dream archetypes.
Does this extend to premonition as well and visions of the future, or do you believe it's always to do with memories?
Well, I think dreams are interesting because it's not always to do with memory. I think some of it is. I think precognitive dreams really happen. I mean, this is not because I have a theory of them. I don't. The morphic resonance is about influences from the past, not from the future. So I don't predict precognitive experiences on the basis of morphic resonance, but I think they happen partly because I've experienced them myself through precognitive dreams, partly because in psychic research, people have studied precognitive dreams in the natural history of them. I studied it myself after the World Trade Center 9/11 disaster in New York. I thought, well, if anyone's going to have precognitive dreams, this would be a pretty good thing to dream about. I mean, it's so spectacular. It became archetypal, that the planes crashing into those towers. Within a few days of the 9/11 disaster, I had advertisements in the Village Voice newspaper in New York and posters in Union Square, New York, and elsewhere, saying, "Did you dream of the World Trade Center?" I have 75 dreams that people sent me. In some cases, they'd told their dreams to someone else, after the dream, but before the disaster. And they were of three main kinds. One kind was people in planes that crashed into a skyscraper, not necessarily the World Trade Center. Sometimes it was the Empire State Building, sometimes the Sears Tower in Chicago. Some of them were being trapped in a burning skyscraper that was collapsing. And some of them were being in the streets of the city with deathly calm, with crowds of dust rolling down the street in a sense of doom and disaster. Being in a doomed city.
People that read reports about the Northwood plans of the CIA were really people that imagined this particular situation, you feel?
Well, you could, that would be an alternative hypothesis. These people weren't precognitively dreaming it. They were picking it up telepathically from the minds of conspirators in the CIA and Mossad or whatever conspiracy theory it is. But I think so many other examples of precognitive dreams. I think
these are known records of the CIA where these plans were, these Northwood plans were published. But no matter. So that's very interesting. I didn't know that you did this. So why wouldn't you extend your fields to the future then? If you have some verifiable data that shows that people do have premonitions or this kind of dreams.
Well, morphic resonance is primarily about habits repeated in the past. And morphic resonance explains unconscious habits. It explains some conscious memories. But I don't think that I don't think it's a total theory of everything. It doesn't in itself explain consciousness. Consciousness, as you know, is the hard problem in philosophy of mind. And morphic resonance is good at explaining unconscious things. It can help explain memory, but consciousness itself and the nature of consciousness is not explained by it, nor is creativity. See, morphic resonance explains habits in evolution, but it doesn't explain how new things happen. And so evolution, biological, psychological, cultural, cosmic, all forms of evolution involve both habits and creativity interacting. And so consciousness and creativity mean there's something else that's not part of morphic resonance. And I think that the nature of consciousness and how far consciousness extends in time is another question. Most precognitions of things in the next 2 or 3 days, occasionally a few weeks or months, but they're very often quite short term. And so then you see, when you think of consciousness, what's its relation to time? As William James and others have talked about it, consciousness is not instantaneous. Our consciousness is spread out in time, which is why when you go to the cinema and you see a film, you see continuous motion rather than a sheer series of still photographs, which is what films are. There are lots of still photos, but if it was instantaneous, the film wouldn't be a movie, it wouldn't be moving. So our consciousness is spread out in time, and it may be spread out in different lengths of time depending on the circumstances. Maybe in dreams, it encompasses a greater time, both future and past. And in waking life, it may be 100 milliseconds or 500 milliseconds or something like that, the spread of it. I don't know. These are mere speculations. I just think there's so much we don't understand, and especially about consciousness itself.
It's interesting that you've touched on creativity as well, because I think they're very related. And that was actually one of the questions I had reading about these habits that are captured in these fields, so that form sort of as a collective memory. And I was interested in how you envision individual innovation shaping these fields. Because I would imagine that you would say, well, if a lot of people have done something in the same way, and this habit becomes stronger than other habits, that makes sense to me. And I think that really fits our observations in the world. If something is done a certain way, then many people gravitate towards these patterns, even of belief. We'll touch on this maybe with the scientific delusion if we come to this, but. Yeah, how do you see innovation or creativity in this? Is not something this theory captures, or?
No, it doesn't capture it because, as I say, it's really about repetition. Morphic resonance is about why things are repeated. And obviously creativity happens, and I think there's a kind of natural selection at every level. I mean, in a sense, I'm not anti-Darwinian, I'm kind of super Darwinian in the sense that I think that even in the realm of nature, crystals, molecules, and so on, whenever an old habit is blocked, you can get creativity, lots of new things happen. And biological mutations, for example, if you irradiate a plant or an animal and cause lots of mutations, you get hundreds of different changes in genes and hundreds of different changes in the organism as it responds to the changed genes. And most mutations are harmful, but some may have a benefit by natural selection, and those are selected by natural selection. They get repeated, and the more often they're repeated, the more habitual they become. And the same in the human realm. I mean, every year there are several million new books published, and there are thousands and thousands of new patents and thousands of new tunes released and so on. But most of them you never hear about again. There's a kind of cultural selection where some tunes become popular and get into the top 10 of pop charts and so on. Others languish and no one ever hears of them. So what I think is at every level, there's a vast amount of creativity, and then there's a selection of a few out of this large range of possibilities, which then become habitual. So there's a kind of natural selection operating at all levels of nature. Now, it just seems to be the case that creativity is inherent in nature. I mean, if you look at evolution, why do we need millions of species of beetles and thousands of species of fish and butterflies and so on? I mean, it's prodigiously creative. Nature is prodigiously creative. The whole universe is. It just seems to be in the nature of things to be creative. But if it was only creative with no natural selection, it would be chaotic. So a combination of creativity, natural selection, and habit, I think, gives us the universe we live in.
Great. That makes sense. You've mentioned Stanislav Grof just now. From him to Richard Tarnas is only a small leap. I was interested. I'm an astrologer myself. Have you read Richard Tarnas's work?
I've read some of it, and I know Richard Tarnas, and he's very kindly done readings on my own charts for me. So, I mean, I haven't studied astrology. I mean, my wife's keen on it, so if I have any astrological questions, I just ask her. But you see, in principle, I think that the state of the solar system at any given time is the solar system's a kind of organism. The planets are in different relative positions to each other, and I think the quality of time within the solar system is changing owing to these movements of the planets. I don't have any problem with that idea. It's simply a fact. But the idea that these can actually influence events on Earth, then for me, it's an evidential question. You know, what's the evidence? And I've seen some evidence, but I've never been motivated to look into it very much. So I sort of, Richard Tarnas' things about the influence of the outer planets and Pluto and so on. It involves looking at a huge amount of historical and biographical data, which I've never felt motivated to do. Because I suppose it's because I've always been more interested in the kinds of experiments I can do. I'm an experimentalist by nature, and my mind rapidly goes to experiments, and I love experiments that can actually do here on Earth, and preferably as simply as possible. Whereas with astrology and indeed astronomy, you can't do experiments. Astronomy is, just like astrology, is an observational science. It's not an experimental science. You can't move a galaxy to see what happens, or blast a star into a different position. Astronomers can't do experiments, and I'm an experimental biologist by nature. I love doing experiments, so that's one reason I've never been drawn to that area. It's more about correlation and so on, which is.
I think some people in Switzerland might disagree with physicists or astronomers not being able to do experiments, but I understand what you mean. Let's move on because of time, maybe because you've already said some things about how you can test this theory. So we now know what these fields are, how you see them, how they relate to some other interesting topics of consciousness or archetypes or even astrology. So let's dive a little bit more into your actual research. Your research is trying to test this theory. As you are a biologist or a biochemist, or well, usually it's the same thing maybe. So maybe you ventured into more spiritual topics of late. Your last couple of books are about these topics. They're about not so much about animal behavior. You've done a lot of research about that, and maybe we can skip over that and tune into the things you're researching now. It's like the sense of being stared at, or the influence of gratefulness, or pilgrimage. I think that's one of the topics you've been studying of late. Would that be a good bridge to look into your current interests and also in this more experimental part of your work?
Yes. Well, I'll start with the sense of being stared at, because you see, I think that our view of ourselves and our minds has been tremendously constricted. The materialist worldview, which is still dominant in the academic world and in science departments and in government and industry and education, has the idea that we live in a universe made up of unconscious matter obeying mathematical laws. And it's all purposeless and unconscious. Everything is made of that unconscious matter. The problem with that view, as you know, is that when it comes to ourselves, how come we're conscious if our brains and our bodies are made of nothing but unconscious matter? The hard problem in the philosophy of mind is that we ought not to be conscious if everything's unconscious. And some philosophers of mind have spent their entire careers trying to prove that we're not conscious. I don't know if they even convince themselves, but they certainly don't convince many other people. And that's why it's called the hard problem, as you know, because we ought not to be conscious. But it's still based on the idea that the materialist idea is the consciousness is generated inside the brain. It's all inside the head. Now, I think that our minds are extended in space and in time. They're extended in time through our desires and our intentions, and possibly, and also through precognitive experiences. They're extended in time in the past by the way we're connected with what's happened before through memory and habit. But I think they're extended in space as well. I don't think they're inside our heads. I think that when we see things, the images we see are outside us exactly where they seem to be. I mean, this is a difficult point to get across because most people take it for granted that when they look at a tree, their image of the tree is where the tree is. It's outside them. They're seeing a tree. It's out there. The official view, of course, is not that. The official view is that light comes in from the tree, changes happen in the retina and the brain, and the brain then generates a virtual reality display of a tree inside the head, a representation of the tree. So it's meant to be inside your brain. Now, that's the official view, and people who've been trained in universities and teach in universities will know that's the official view, and that's what they'll say if you ask them. If you ask most people, they don't think like that. They don't experience that. They don't have a theory that goes so against their own experience. They think their mind, that somehow the image is where it seems to be. And I think they're right. This is what people over the whole world have always thought is what children think in our own culture. People assume the images are out there where they seem to be. So if that's true, that would mean our minds extend in every act of vision. As throughout the world, everything we look at, even if we look at a star, the mind reaches out in a sense to touch a distant star across literally astronomical distances. So our minds may be extended in everyday experience just through vision. So to test that, how do you test it? Do we really project out images? Is this just a way of speaking or a kind of an alternative framework or something? I think it's actual fact, and it should be testable. So if I look at you from behind and you don't know I'm there, could my mind reaching out to touch you by projecting an image to where you are be felt by you? Could you sense you're being looked at and turn around and find I'm looking at you? And when you ask that question, you find that it's extremely common. It's 95% of people, including children, who've experienced being stared at from behind. You turn around and there's someone looking at you, or you stare at someone and they turn around and look back. It doesn't happen all the time or every time, but it does happen. And it happens with animals too. They're very sensitive to it, more sensitive than most humans. So I've been doing research on this for many years, and indeed, I had an experiment in the Netherlands for 25 years at the Nemo Center in Amsterdam. It was one of the most popular exhibits. It was called You may have seen it yourself. Have you got eyes in the back of your head? And it was very popular with families. And children would sit there blindfolded, and behind, a computer would tell the person behind them whether to stare or not to stare. And their response was either right or wrong. And it recorded and statistically analyzed the results. Hundreds of thousands of trials happened with the statistical significance was astronomical, that most people had got eyes in the back of their head. They could tell when they're being looked at. And it was all analyzed statistically by a statistician at the Free University in Amsterdam, Jan van Polhuis. And and this experiment ran, and what it showed was the most sensitive subjects were children under the age of 9, which is what I found myself. Anyway, my point is this is something you can do research on. A lot of research has been done. This seems to be a real phenomenon. And what my latest iteration of this research is an app which works on mobile telephones. It's called iSense.training, EYE, iSense.training. And I'm currently recruiting people to take part in this research. I've set up a research group, and I invite anyone who hears this to look into it. If they go to my website, they'll find sheldrake.org. They'll find the iSense training app, and they can email me, and I'll put them on to through the website. There's a contact address, and put them on to
Play and the Apple Store. How do you call the other one?
Yes, it's on Apple and Android. Yes, it's on those stores. iSense.
The other experiment you told me about before we went into this recording, the joint attention tests with nursing mothers. Is that also via an app, or is that?
No, the joint attention is can you tell when someone else is looking at the same thing as you? And by the age of 1, most babies learn to look at the same thing. It's a big step in child development. Children who don't develop this often turn out to be autistic. But that's why when you see parents walking around with children, I've done it myself, you're in the street and they point to say doggy, or cat or tree. And this pointing and looking at the same thing brings minds into a kind of resonance with each other. And I've done experiments that show that if you look at the same object, for example, if I have a sheet of paper like that, say, imagine that's a wall, and if someone's there and I'm this side, you have an object there, you're both looking at the same object, but you can't see each other, like put an apple in a doorway. So the wall, you're both on different sides of the wall, you can't see each other. Then using my same app, iSense training app, you can do experiments where one person either looks or doesn't look at the apple, and the other person has to guess if it's being looked at or not. Can you tell when someone else is looking at the same thing? Do your eye beams intersect or interact? If we're projecting eye beams, which are part of our extended minds, do extended minds interact? So I have a research group for joint attention as well. And anyone who wants to can take part.
Yeah, wonderful. So, but you're especially looking, you told me, for nursing mothers, right?
Oh, that's another project. Yes. So let me just briefly outline that, because
I thought that's the joint attention experiment, but those are different things then. Yeah.
Yes, the nursing mother one is a telepathy experiment.
Okay. Yeah.
I've done a lot of research on telepathy because I think minds resonate with each other at a distance for people who are bonded. I've published a big review last year of research by myself and by others, including Dick Bierman at the University of Amsterdam, about telephone telepathy. Can you tell when someone's intending to phone you? When the phone rings, a lot of people just know who it is before they look at the caller ID or answer it. That's a telepathy experiment. I've done a lot on that, but we haven't time to discuss that. But what I'm looking at right now is telepathy between babies and nursing mothers. Many nursing mothers have had the experience that when they start going back to work after breastfeeding for a few months at home. They go back to work. And what they find is that when they're at work or when they're in shopping or something away from their baby, they feel their milk lets down. Well, you and I have never experienced this, not being women, but what it feels like for women is that their breasts tingle. Not all women find this, and the breast starts squeezing out milk. It's an oxytocin-mediated reflex. Normally it happens when the mother hears the baby cry. But when they're away from the baby and this happens to them, most mothers just assume that their baby needs them. And they used to just go home. Now they ring home on their mobile phone. And I'd done a study on this 25 years ago, and we found that they were usually right. It was hugely significant statistically. The mothers seemed to be a telepathic response. It wasn't just synchronized rhythms or anything. It seemed to be a telepathic response. Very basic, fundamental form of telepathy. They didn't think about it. Their breasts responded. Then they thought about it. It was a physiological response. So I now have a research assistant working with me. We've launched a project with nursing mothers and babies. And now what we're doing is many mothers now have video baby monitors. They have smartphones to film this. Before we didn't film it. We just wrote down the observations. But now we're doing a filmed study with nursing mothers. So if anyone watching this is nursing a baby, they've started going back to work. And if they notice that their milk lets down when their baby needs them, and would like to take part in the study for which there's a modest payment for participation, then again, get in touch with me through my website by email.
Wonderful, wonderful. So maybe just to, I know we're short on time, but I think we've established as far as we can in a short podcast that what this theory is, how it works, that you've been working tirelessly to prove this or to do or devise experiments. You've been doing this since 1981, I think, of devising experiments. Not all universities have picked up on it, but can we go to the consequences? Or maybe you've been writing about spiritual about spiritual experiences more and more. What are the implications of this idea of morphic resonance, and what would you like to? I mean, if this is all true, and I believe you're onto something, and I think most people that are not blinded by mechanistic materialism understand that there's something to this. What implications does that have? What does it mean for us as a human species or as conscious beings? What should we learn from this?
Well, there are many, many implications, of course, for the way we interpret nature, or the way we experience ourselves and our families and ancestors. But some of the aspects I've been interested in relation to spiritual practices, through the use of mantras and rituals. All religions have rituals, and in fact, all societies have them. And what rituals often involve is reenacting some primal act in the history of the group. So Jewish people every year celebrate the Feast of Passover, which reenacts the Passover dinner of the Jewish people in Egypt the night before they left slavery in Egypt to journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land. And they reenact that dinner. And with the right food, the right words, the bitter herbs, and so forth. And what I think is happening is that by taking part in the ritual today, or at least on Passover, people affirm their Jewish identity as part of the group. They, as it were, resonate together by doing the same thing. But they also resonate with all the people who've done it before them, right back to the first Passover, connecting with the ancestors and connecting also prospectively connecting with those who do it after them, in generations to come. And Christian Holy Communion, itself a Passover dinner, is similar. Present participants share a meal together, a ritual meal, bread and wine of Christ, and become part of a community by having this ritual meal together, but also connect with all those who've done it before, right back to the original Last Supper. And the American Thanksgiving dinner is a secular ritual, a national ritual, where every year the Americans gather together to have this ritual meal with turkey and things, which is a commemoration of the original harvest Thanksgiving dinner for the first settlers in New England, for giving thanks for surviving their first year in the New World. And through taking part in these rituals, people become part of a group in the present. They become part of a social group through joint participation and joint attention. And through morphic resonance, they become connected with all those who've done it before. And that's what people think they're doing in rituals. They think they're connecting with those who've done it before. That's why rituals are conservative. If you do it the same way, you'll connect better than if you keep changing it. And I think rituals make tremendous sense in the light of morphic resonance. So I think it sheds a great light on that particular kind of spiritual practice. And another one that you mentioned, what I'm very keen on at the moment, is pilgrimage, because pilgrimage was a great thing in Europe, as in everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world has pilgrimages, journeys to sacred places, which are the meeting points of heaven and earth. You know, in Stonehenge in England, 5,000 years ago, people were congregating at these great megalithic temples at those solstices, midsummer and midwinter, coming on a pilgrimage to celebrate together. And these link heaven and earth. The stones, upright stones, link heaven and earth, megaliths. Then Egyptians had obelisks. We have towers and spires of churches. Mosques have minarets. And so sacred places have a vertical dimension, which I think literally connects heaven and earth, because these vertical structures attract lightning and bring physical influences into the earth at that point. So I think there's a physical aspect. But I think that when we visit places which have been visited before in a spiritual manner for ceremonies and rituals on pilgrimage, we connect with the experience of those who've been in that place before. There's a kind of memory in the place. I don't think it's etched in the stones, because I don't think memory is material, but I think we resonate with people who've been there before and experiencing the same stimuli from being in the same place. And pilgrimage to sacred places, archetypal in all cultures. I mean, Muslims have them to Mecca and to shrines of holy men. Hindus have lots of pilgrimages. Buddhists have pilgrimages. Hunter-gatherer societies have song lines, like in Australia, where they go to these prominent places in the landscape in their annual journeys around the landscape. And all of Europe was crisscrossed by pilgrimage routes in the Middle Ages, to Santiago, to Compostela, to Canterbury, to Trondheim Cathedral in Norway, the shrine of Olaf. But in the Protestant Reformation, this was suppressed. In England, it was made illegal in 1538 to go on pilgrimages. And in most Protestant countries, pilgrimage was abolished, which left a void in the soul of Northern Europeans. I think that's why the English invented tourism. I think it's best seen as a form of secularized pilgrimage, where tourists still go to great sacred places, but when they get there, they can't kneel down and say a prayer or light a candle or do a puja in the Hindu temple.
Yeah, and you need to make a selfie.
Yes, they have to pretend that they're there. At the very least, they take a selfie, but if they're a bit more intellectual about it, they have to pretend they're interested in art history or something like that, when in fact they're not really very interested in art history at all in most cases. So I think what's going on is connecting with this, being drawn to these places where there's this sense of connection. And what's going on in Europe at the moment, I don't know about the Netherlands, but certainly in Spain, the revival of pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela is huge. And when they first revived it in its modern form in the 1980s, 1987, 1,000 people walked there. Last year, 500,000 people walked there. And in Britain, in the last 10 years, the British Pilgrimage Trust, of which I'm a patron, has been reopening the ancient footpath pilgrimage routes and developing new ones to our ancient holy places, to holy wells, to the sources of rivers, to the great cathedrals. And this has become pretty mainstream activity now. It's astonishing how quickly this has caught on, attracting many young people, and many people who would describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, because it's deeply satisfying to go on the journey, connecting with nature, walking through the countryside, connecting with ancient holy places. And so I think that one reason I'm interested in it, because I like doing it myself, but also because in terms of morphic resonance, it makes sense to me as to why this should be a satisfying pursuit and an important one.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds very, very inviting. Yeah, I know you've also written a lot about the connection of people with nature, but let me yeah, let us end maybe with this question. I've asked you a few times about the future, about consciousness as a whole. You talk a lot about habits and habit forming. That's because that's what your theory is about. But you're also a religious man. Is there a difference in quality between habits? There are also very bad habits in the world, and we seem to perpetuate a few of them as we speak. We're entering a time of well, war and conflict. Do you think there's a qualitative difference between habits that you can derive from your theory of morphic resonance? Is there maybe a collective resonance with good rather than with evil, or is this not something you venture into as a biologist, which you could imagine?
Well, I think I don't think there's a moral filter in morphic resonance. I think any habits will be propagated by morphic resonance, good and bad. And so the only moral aspect of it is a little bit like Kant's idea of the categorical imperative, because what morphic resonance says is we influence others at a distance without even knowing who they are by what we say, by what we do, and also by what we think, by our attitudes, because there's a resonant influence of those from the point of view of morphic resonance. And so good habits can spread by morphic resonance. I mean, but so can bad habits. And right now, the habit that's spreading most in the world is consumerism, which we in Europe and North America have exported to the whole of the rest of the world with advertising, TV, consumer goods, supermarkets, and so forth, encouraging everyone to become acquisitive. And I think if we look at the traditional theory, in the Christian world, it makes sense to me, this model that we have the 7 deadly sins, which are 7 bad habits, pride, envy, lust, gluttony, and so on. And we have the 7 virtues, prudence, temperance, justice, and then the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. And so these are all habits. Virtues, in Aristotle's formulation, are habits of behavior, habits of conduct. And the problem we have in the modern world is that since most people are not religious any longer in much of Western Europe, nobody teaches anyone about virtue, and it's just considered old-fashioned or something. Whereas there's every incentive to the 7 deadly sins. I mean, we're deluged with advertising and social media, which encourages us to be more proud, more envious, more lustful, more greedy, more avaricious, more lazy. I mean, all the 7 deadly sins are encouraged on a daily basis in every possible way. And the virtues, the good habits, are not encouraged by hardly anyone. So I think that it's really important in as we move to the future to revisit the whole idea of good habits of behavior, which can be taught to children and to grown-ups, and which used to be taught, still are in some families, but they're not really taught in our educational system very much, because I suppose the virtue of tolerance is taught by the educational system. But it's basically a tolerance of other people's beliefs. It's not, you couldn't say to people, look, these are traditional Christian European virtues, because that would be discriminatory for people who are not Christian or non-believers or atheists and stuff. So you can't do it in our schools. So it leaves a vacuum. And I think that this is a real crisis for European and American civilization, really, because there has to be some countervailing force to the destructive powers of greed, corporate greed, individual greed, consumerism, and so on, which are destroying the planet and destroying our society. So I think there are lessons we can learn and things we can think about on the basis of these general principles, including scientific principles. But I don't have a blueprint as to how to implement these. We don't have an educational reform policy and so on. I do what I can. And I think that the encouragement of pilgrimage, which is one of my main activist areas in Britain, is one of the things I do, because I think this can be a really helpful way of changing behavior. And perhaps one final point is that a great friend of mine in the United States, a psychologist friend, has a slogan where he says, if you want to change the world, throw a better party. And I think one of the advantages of pilgrimage is it's a better party. It's fun to do. And it's attractive and it's fun to do. And I think it helps in connecting with nature, with other people, with tradition, with ancestors, with those who've gone before, and gives a healing sense of connection with the land and the place. And I think this is one of the things we can do. So my own attempts at activism are all based on the principle it has to be fun. You're not going to make much difference if you make people feel guilty, ashamed, and so on. I mean, they'll just flick to another channel. So I think the real challenge is to find ways of making living a better life more fun.
Sounds like a good resolution. Create better habits, create deeper habits, and they can be tolerant, but tolerance is also presumes a lot of good habits, and you need to integrate them with a lot of people. So, yeah, I can follow you. That's a nice. I didn't expect to come to Kant today, so that's a nice way to finish. Yeah, let's leave it there. There are a few habits for people to maybe click on the subscribe button below this video if you're into these kinds of interviews, because I will conduct some more conversations on English. I'll work on my English in the meantime. And check out the website of Mr. Sheldrake. It's sheldrake.org, and you can find the apps there as well. Mr. Sheldrake, thank you very much for being with us for this conversation. And well, maybe we'll speak again, but I wish you all good luck with your experiments and your research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and all the best for your series.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.